Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific review from the brand new selection of cars in the 1.15 update, and this is another one that's obvious to talk about relatively early on because it's a brand new car to the game, and also you could say even more importantly it's from a manufacturer that we don't get new cars from that often in the world of Gran Turismo, and that is of course Aston Martin with the DB11. Now, back in the day, I wasn't much of an Aston fan. I didn't really care either way for them, but now I do, and there are plenty of Astons that I really like. I've talked about some of them before on the channel, like the Signet, the Lagonda, the Rapide. I tend to like their more oddball choices, but this one marks a new direction for the brand. It's a fairly obvious one to go for if you're going to add a newer Aston to the game. It's a shame that we don't get more of their racing ones, because of course this is pretty much the first time in the entire franchise that we had a proper Aston Martin race car. Way back on Gran Turismo 2, you could turn the DB7 into a race car, but still, it's not really the same thing. Now though, we of course have the Vantage, which was in the game day one. This one though is a different new direction, because it's a production scale vehicle. And of course, vehicles like this one, the DB11, really do show the new direction of style that Aston Martin is taking. You have a much more pronounced and I would say more bulbous and muscular front end to the car, whereas before Aston Martins have, I would say, a more elegant style, especially stuff like the Rapide and the DBS. They're very well proportioned cars. Nothing really stands out because everything about the car complements the rest of it, whereas this new design style is much more front heavy. The front of the car is very big, bulky, very rounded, the lights are smaller, the grille is smaller, the body itself is bigger, so it gives the car this more, I would say, bloated appearance, but not necessarily in a bad way. I do think they look good. I just definitely wouldn't put this on par with something like a DBS. I don't think it even comes close, to be honest. But since Bond's Aston in Spectre, we started to see this new trend of Aston style with the rounder, smoother, simpler shapes. The Vulcan, as well, also has a very similar back end to this one, but of course came out before it. And the engine, even, is a totally new direction, because when you think of bigger Astons, not like the V8 Vantages, but the real big stuff, like again, the Vanquishes, the DBSs, that kind of caliber, you typically think of them as having these big V12s, naturally aspirated, around 6 litres, sometimes more, generally a 5.9 for instance. Then you occasionally get a special like the 177 with that big naturally aspirated 7.3 litre V12, but now once again we've got that new direction, much smaller, a 5.2 litre, still a V12, which I think is pretty cool because the V12 in all honesty probably isn't much longer for the automotive scene with the way regulations are going and the efficiencies that you can get out of a V8 engine plus manufacturing costs. V12s I think are going to be strangled more and more by regulation in coming years. Mercedes has already started to move away from them, and speaking of Mercedes, they of course have a tie-in to this car as well, because later there was a V8 version of this car released with a 4 litre, in a similar way to what Bentley did with the Continental, having the big W12 and then the smaller V8, and that V8 is from Mercedes, whereas this twin-turbo V12 is from Aston themselves, and that again is a totally new direction for the brand, having this twin-turbo engine instead of a naturally aspirated one. So when you add all of this together, this is an Aston really only in name. Underneath it's a completely new vehicle, like nothing else that they've done before, really. So it's a risky move. Are you going to upset the stalwarts of the brand who have loved it for years, or are you going to bring in fresh meat, the younger generation who has the money to buy something like this? Well, to some degree I think you could probably tick both of those boxes, because there are definitely people, purists for instance, even I myself, I prefer naturally aspirated engines if at all possible. Under some circumstances though, it makes sense. And those two circumstances I would say in particular are when you want extreme outright speed, something like an Ultima Aero or a Venom GT or the quad turbo Veyron, but on the other hand, efficiency is another good reason, which you probably wouldn't think of, but that's actually a very strong reason, and it's why you see more and more turbo aspirated cars even on a much lower end of the production scale, non-performance cars even. So with all of this in mind, what is the DB11 like as an overall package compared to previous Astons? Well, in some ways I would say it still feels very true to the brand. It has a much more of an emphasis than most other exotics on being an overall package. If you think, for instance, of something like a Lambo or a Ferrari, they tend to have less of a focus on luxury and long-distance appeal. They have some, but that's not really what they're entirely about. Whereas with companies like Bentley or Aston, they do have much more of that. That remains. You can see that from the interior, you can almost see it really from the outside of the car as well. It has more of a long-distance GT kind of look to it, rather than a pure SuperSports or pure supercar, and even the fact that it's front-engine rear-wheel drive ties into that as well. Now the car is pretty heavy, it weighs 1770 kilos, but that's not really anything new for Astons. They've always been quite weighty cars because of the luxury factor. But you are putting out a lot more power than something like a DBS or an older Vanquish in particular. Any of those older generations, say earlier late 2000s ones, you're looking at a fraction under 600 horsepower from this thing. So you really are getting up into Bentley Continental GT kind of territory. Now it's still rear-wheel drive, which I think is pretty good for an Aston. It's not really necessary to make it anything but that. And I have to say, as you could even see from the start of this video at the bottom of the screen on my mileage meter, this is literally the first laps that I've ever done with the car in the game. And it hooks up immediately. You get into it, you can drift it super easily, the handling is a pleasure to work with. You can certainly feel the weight, for sure, and I haven't modified the car in terms of upgrades, but even so, it's good straight out of the box. Now the category is N600, as you'd safely assume, and for that level, it's not going to worry everything. There are certain cars, for instance, if you tune up a 911 GT3, which has a massive weight advantage, as quite a few others do, that's the kind of circumstance where a car like this will struggle a little bit, because although it has straight line power, straight line torque, 516 pound-feet, incidentally, and even the horsepower per tonne isn't bad for what it is. 338 is decent enough for an exotic luxury GT, but it's definitely going to struggle against lighter ones. I mean, that sounds like an obvious statement, but there are some occasions where a car can overcome that. For instance, the Bentley. It's a deceptively fast car, given how obscenely heavy it is. With an Aston, on the other hand, they can sometimes fall behind a little bit. And that goes for any modern Aston exotic, because they are heavier, they are more inclined towards being comfortable and long distance in nature, rather than trying to set world record lap times. And as great as that is in the real world, this is one of those occasions where you can lose some of that in the translation from real world to game. So that is something which will always affect an Aston, at least in the road going world, but overall I'm very happy with this car in the game. I'm not a super fan of it, but I love the way it sounds, the way it performs, and the way it handles in particular is a pleasure to work with. And the pricing is quite reasonable as well, so definitely worth checking out in the game. And that's it for this pick, so of course stick around on the channel for breakdowns and tunes for all of the new cars, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.